Hey there, friends. Welcome to episode 46 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. I've got little Callie in my arms for just a moment because I had a couple people asking for updates on our dogs. You may have just seen Moo jump over my shoulder. Everybody's doing really well after the passing of Peaches, and they're actually bonding really well. I don't have Moo in my arms right now because he's in the cone of sadness. He has a bit of an ear infection, so we're trying to prevent him from scratching his ears. But we're going to the vets this afternoon to go get that taken care of. I just wanted to let you know, if you are new here or not new here, make sure you stick around to the end of this episode. We're going to do a quick catch up on my scheduling for this podcast, and it might be worth you taking note of a few things. So let's jump into today's topic. All right, I love starting an episode with my dogs. I know not everybody's as into them as I am, but people asked to see them, so that was Callie. So today we are going to be talking about adding short row shaping to the bottom of a yoke. The purpose of adding shaping to a yoke using short rows, whether it's done at the neckline edge or at the bottom of the yoke, like we're going to talk about today, is to add some shaping for our natural slope to our shoulders, but also to accommodate for the fact that if you measure from your center front neck, sort of right at the base of your clavicle, down to an imaginary line, let's say the top of your pants, and then did the same down the back of your sweater, your back length is going to be longer. So the variance in length between the front and back of your body when you're measuring sort of center front and center back, sort of that C6, C7 spinal, what's it called? Vertebrae. The difference in length can be a result of having, a curve in your back, or can just be a natural result of your posture. Everybody is slightly longer on the back than the front in any case. If you try to do this measurement on yourself, because of course I did it on myself before I recorded today's episode, you want to make sure that the elevation that you're measuring to, if you use, say, the top of your pants, is the same. On a lot of bodies with bums, most bodies with bums, if you've got kind of a higher sitting level of where your bum sits, your pants may sit higher in the back. I know that's a lot more information than you need, but all I wanted to say is when I first took the measurement, I was like, hey, my back length is shorter. It's not actually. It's just where my pants ride up in the back higher than they do in the front because of the way my body is shaped. So if you decide to do this exercise for yourself, make sure whatever the horizontal level that you are measuring to on your body is actually the same distance from the floor. You don't need to know that information for today's episode, but if you're curious, it's some measurements you can take on yourself or have someone else help you take, because it's always a little bit of help, or a little bit easier with someone there to help. So when I create these episodes, I know what I know, but I also like to go and do a little bit of research to find out what other people are saying about the method that I'm going to talk to you, because a lot of designers are going to have different opinions on things, and I want to acknowledge that these are not always going to be the same as mine. And I don't think that any one of us is more right or more wrong. I just share what I know with you and hope that I can help you on your journey. So the one thing that I found that was consistent across all of the different articles and patterns that I looked at to confirm my approach to short row shaping at the bottom of a yoke is the same, and that's kind of comforting. Essentially, it's when you're doing your short row shaping at the bottom of a yoke, you're making your first short row, if you're working top down, the longest. So you're working the furthest around your garment, and then you're tapering it off slowly across the back of the garment. Now, the percentages that people use, just like in episodes 43 and 44, where I discussed percentages of short rows around a garment, those variables change. Some designers use only the back of the garment, not going past sort of the seam line of a shoulder. Other designers carry the short rows right into the front of the garment, so you're kind of crossing into the chest area. I'm in the third camp, if you will. I tend to work to a max of about 60% of the circumference of the garment and end at 30%. And the reasons for that are twofold, and I'm going to have a graphic up on the screen to explain this. But the first one, the first reason I don't fall into the camp of bringing the short rows into the front of the garment, basically not crossing this front sleeve edge, whether you're working raglan or whether you're working in a circular yoke, is largely practical. While I would love to say that my short row techniques are perfect and you can never see where my short row turning points are, that's not true. And so the less interruption I have visually in the front of a garment, in my opinion, the better. So I tend to stop my short rows at 60%. And then let's look at a graphic and talk about why I use that 60% and 30%. So in contrast to my preferred percentages of shaping when you're working short rows at the top of a yoke, where I like to work 60% up to 80%, my preferred shaping or percentage of shaping when working short rows at the bottom of a yoke starts at 60% and then works its way back to about 30%. On the left side of the graphic, we have this basic layout of the top-down garment before any short rows are added. If you're working a raglan style yoke, the sleeve locations will be very obvious. There's usually lines of increases or you have markers placed there. If you're working a circular yoke style sweater where markers are not yet placed for the sleeves because you haven't divided them out yet or because the designer simply didn't include them, that's okay. The sleeves are still divided out at approximately the same ratios for any top-down yoke style garment where you've got raglans or circular. So don't worry if you can't actually see where your sleeves fall within the garment. For the purposes of this example, I've assumed that the beginning of round marker is at the center back. But if it's at the side of the garment, that's okay. You'll just need to adjust the percentage you work on your first short row. An example of working relative to a side seam beginning of round can be found in episode 44, which I've linked below. So the 60% of the total circumference will include all of the back of the sweater and work into the sleeves so that the slope that we add to accommodate our back length being longer than our front length blends into the back of the sleeve too. And that's why I choose these percentages. If I was going to be working at a 50% ratio and use only the back of the garment, I think I would find that the stopping point of the first turning short row wouldn't feel like it accurately represents the slope of my back being longer. I'm finding it very hard to find the words to explain that concept, but I'm hoping that when you look at the graphic, it makes sense that the 60% will include all of the back of your sweater and the majority of your sleeves, so that the tilting really occurs where the lengthening of our body occurs, which is from our shoulders or our front shoulders back. So the shortest length is at the center front, and as our body goes around, it gets longer when we measure it relative to that horizontal element I was talking about when taking measurements. So I won't go into all of the details of breaking down the math in the percentages because we've covered those sorts of details in both episodes 43 and 44. But when you look at the right-hand side of the graphic, you can see that those short rows cross into the sleeves, whether you can see them in a raglan sweater or whether you can't see them in a circular yoke sweater, and then slowly taper narrower and narrower towards the back of the garment. When you get down to the 30% of your garment, you're going to be working only in the back body, so that will still be the longest portion of the garment. So in essence, despite the percentages being slightly different than when you work your short rows at the collar, we've basically just replicated what we would do if we were working it here. The reason to work it at the bottom of the yoke rather than at the top is largely for aesthetic purposes. You may have a colorful yoke that's got a stitch pattern design and you want to have the same depth of collar all the way around. If you were to work the short rows at the top, they would likely just be a solid section of stockinette stitch above the colorwork design. And some designers don't want to have that. The other reason to do it would be is if you've got a really decorative raglan panel in a raglan style yoke, working those short rows into those raglan sections can be really tricky, and so you can work them in stockinette just before you separate for the sleeves so that you're not interrupting any of that patterning that you may have in the yoke only. I will say that if you're not doing this at the very top of your yoke, you're probably going to want to do this right before you separate for your sleeves, just because I find that's easier. It doesn't interrupt with any increase rounds that you may have between the bottom of any color work that you're working and the separation of the sleeves. But there's really no wrong way or wrong vertical place to work it in the yoke, in my opinion. So if you finish your color work yoke and you have no more shaping before you separate for the sleeves, you can work it right at the bottom of that color work chart. Just make sure that you have one full even round knit, meaning you've resolved all of your short rows before you divide for your sleeves. You just don't want to be trying to resolve those short rows as you're separating your sleeves from the body, and then potentially when you're picking stitches up at the underarm as well. It just makes it slightly more complicated. So that kind of brings us to the end of our little mini series about short rows, but I wanted to give you a bit of an update on my schedule and how it pertains to this podcast. While I am overwhelmed at the growth in our community and so touched by the engagement that everybody is participating in here, as my work life continues to grow and I'm editing more books, which is a blessing in and of itself, I'm finding it really hard to maintain the schedule of doing this every week. When I first sat down to create this podcast, I thought they would be quick episodes that I could be like, hey, here's a tip. I know this and now you know it. But as I'm discovering and loving, a lot of you want to know the technical side of things. And so when I create these videos, it's really important that I get the technical information to you in a way that is hopefully easily digestible. But it does mean that I spend a really significant portion of my week, every week, creating the episode, then shooting the episode, and then editing the episode. And the editing, believe it or not, takes the biggest bulk of the time. So what I'd like to do is start to move this podcast to be every 2 weeks. It will still be on Wednesdays, and I will still be looking for ideas of things to talk about. It just won't be quite as regular an interval. I think the other reality to consider is that the first 3 or 4 months of the year, so January through mid-March to early April, there's a lot of people that are really active with knitting because it's cool and we're staying inside. But as the year starts to get warmer, we also see a big drop in viewership and people participating. So by having a little bit more time each week, I feel like I can give, or every 2 weeks, I guess I should say, I feel like I can give you better quality episodes, but it's also maybe going to be more digestible for you because you're not here every week trying to learn something new. So that's where we're at with this. I hope you'll continue to join me and enjoy the journey with me. And with that said, in 2 weeks, I'm going to have a conversation about collars. Not short rows specifically, because we've talked about short rows before, and not even necessarily modifying them as we've done in a previous episode, which I think was episode 4 or 6. I'll make sure it's linked below if you're curious about modifying the circumference of necklines. But what I want to talk about is how different necklines can be used, how you can add structure to necklines, and how you can maybe look at modifying a pattern to fit you a little bit better relative to how the collar sits on your, neck and upper chest as you're working a yoke. So I hope you'll join me in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It always means a lot to me, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Have a great rest of this week, and happy knitting.